How can a man satisfy these men here in the wilderness? That's what the disciples said to Jesus, facing the dilemma. You got a multitude of people out here in the wilderness. They've been with you 4 days. They've ran out of food. They're hungry. And Jesus asked the disciples, what should we do? And they said, well, let's just send them home. And Jesus said, no, we'll feed them. And so now the question begins, well, how are we going to do this with all of this multitude of people? And so they took inventory, and they said, well, we've got a couple fish and 7 loaves. And the disciples, of course, they said, well, what is that among so many? In other words, what is this insignificant amount based upon what we have a multitude to feed? Now, when I was preaching this to my congregation, as we've been also studying through the Gospel of Mark, I said to my people, I said, what's missing here in Mark's version of the story? As Mark is telling this, and we've talked about this here in the Gospel of Mark, he doesn't give us a lot of elaboration about things. He basically just gives us the details and the facts, and he moves on. So I said, what are we missing here in this story? And I'm sure that in your mind, you're asking the same question. Well, what's he talking about? What are we missing? The little boy. Remember? When John tells this same story, he tells us there was a little boy. And there in the midst of all of that multitude, there was one little boy that had him a little lunch, and he's the one that had the fish and the bread. And the disciples, they discovered this, and so they took the little boy to Jesus and said, hey, he's got some food here. But again, the question is such a small amount. What good is it going to do in facing the dilemma that we're facing? Well, whenever I think about that, I think about the encounter that Moses had with the Lord. When God was saying to Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to deliver that multitude of people out of Egypt into the promised land. And Moses just threw up his hands and said, you got the wrong man here. And they began to tell him, he said, look, I have this problem with my speech. And Jesus, or God said, what's that in your hand? And Moses said, a rod. And God said, cast it on the ground. And of course, when he cast it onto the ground, it became a serpent. You see, what we find here is that with God, little things can become tremendous things when faith is involved. You remember I told you this about the woman we talked about yesterday, the Greek woman who wanted her daughter to be healed. I said she had the ingredient that brings success, faith. And what Jesus is teaching his disciples here, as well as the multitude of the great possibilities when there's faith. Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.